When his heart stopped, his family, his band, and the entire music world didn't want to believe it. It was September 25th, 1980, and I'm talking about John Harry Bonham, better known as John Bonham, drummer of Led Zeppelin. For those who don't know me, I am Linda. This channel is called Morbid One Biographies, and here I talk each time about the life of a legendary figure in the music world. Intro. After the various upheavals that Led Zeppelin had experienced in recent years, they were ready for a new beginning. Instead, he died in the midst of rehearsals that would have led them to a new tour, famous for his speed, his power, and his distinctive sound. For his unmatched groove, and for 1,000 other reasons, more or less technical, which I invite you to add in the comments if you wish. John Bonham is considered one of the greatest and most influential drummers in rock history, having influenced countless drummers. Among these, I can only mention a few that come to mind, namely Dave Lombardo, Dave Grohl, Chad Smith. But in short, the list would be very long. In this video, I will not talk to you about Bonham's technique, his specific techniques, because it's not my area of expertise. However, if you are interested in this, I will put in the comments the link to a YouTuber who talks specifically about his technique. The video is entirely in English, but with Italian subtitles. And I really recommend it to you. To understand why John Bonham died so young, in this video we will look at how money, fame, success, power, and especially pressure affected his psyche. Crushed over time by media pressure, and especially by the stress of tours and constant travel, John Bonham actually had a jovial and generous character. Many people who knew him before he became famous remember his kindness. And initially, none of his acquaintances would have bet that he would succumb to the rock world. John Harry Bonham was born on May 31st, 1948 in Redditch, England, to John and Jack Bonham. His father ran a construction business in which he employed both sons, John and Michael. At the age of 5, he showed an interest in music, beginning to learn how to play. He created a kit from coffee cans and bath salts containers equipped with a metal wire at the bottom to create a primitive snare drum. Then he added pots and pans imitating his idols Max Roach, Gene Krupa, Studdy Richard. But it was only when he was 15 that his father gave him a real drum set. Bonham never took lessons. Real ones, we can call them that for drums, but he received many tips from the most influential drummers in the area. In fact, precisely because of this, from a very young age, besides working in his father's construction business, he also played in various local bands. The era of the Beatles was advancing forcefully, but John Bonham preferred jazz drummers at the time. In fact, other figures who made him fall in love were Joe Morello, the same Jones Krupa, whom I already mentioned, Sonny Page. And from these individuals, he learned the skill of twirling drumsticks. But then came the time when he necessarily had to take drum lessons. And it was there that his rock imprint was sown. And it was precisely John Bonham. He himself would say in the future more and more times that he continued playing the drums while also studying them. Then on a technical level, because it was the only thing he actually knew how to do. And it is for this reason that at 16 years old, he decided that music would be his life. But he still had to work on construction sites to support himself. Why am I telling you this? Because he, precisely due to having such rough hands, from manual labor, could afford to play the drums with his hands. This can be clearly perceived in several Zeppelin tracks, but Moby Dick is the one where this factor is most prominent. He soon realized his artistic superiority, and so he began to ask the bands he saw performing in his area if he could play the drums, maybe for a song, in place of the official drummer. And he did this especially when he was interested in joining that band. Obviously, the unfortunate drummers who suffered the humiliation of seeing John Bonham play so well compared to them were not very happy about it, but he did it precisely to showcase his talent. Perhaps he also took a certain pleasure in doing this, I don't know, but he did it mainly to earn a living. In 1964, he joined his first professional band, Harry Webb and the Spiders, and around the same time he met his future wife, Pat Phil. At 17, he married his girlfriend, Pat Phil, but since the two didn't have much money, they went to live in a trailer that belonged to John's father. Afterwards, with the first bit of money they saved, they moved into a skyscraper in Dudley, which, believe it or not, they were still living in during the period when Led Zeppelin became successful with their first album. After the band broke up, Bonham joined another group. It was a blues band called the Crawling King Snakes, and the singer was Robert Plant. Two roosters in one hen house, and we know the result, right? Okay, so their relationship was immediately filled with jabs, power plays, but in reality they became great friends. He left that group, however, to join another band called Way of Life. And during the recording of the demo, John played so loudly that he was told by the recording studio director, that it was unrecordable and that there was no future for him. Guys, I'm not making this stuff up. It's just that lately, while talking about these immense artists, I realized that all of them have been told something similar. In fact, what did Bonham do? Years later, he sent this director his first gold record, one with Led Zeppelin. Well, what a satisfaction. Anyway, Plant and Bonham reunited in the third and final formation of the group. This group was called Band of Joy, where in '67 fashion was changing and they also adopted a more hippie look. And it was precisely with them that Robert Plant suddenly brought out his style, his energy during a concert, which is what still today makes him recognizable, drives the audience crazy. In a memorable concert at the Queen Mary Ballroom in Dudley, in fact, Robert Plant suddenly put on a performance that we can find in various pieces today, but is especially recognizable in the piece. All Out the Love. Plant wrapped the cord around the microphone stand, simulating a simple act. In the audience was Bonham's mother, who was attending the concert that very evening. When she saw Robert Plant doing that stuff, she stood up, horrified, shouting, "Oh, John, come away from there immediately. That boy is a pervert." And John Bonham listened to her, but certainly not because of Robert Plant's performance. He listened to her because there was Tim Robert, an American singer-songwriter who was touring at that time in England, and he hired him for £50 a week to accompany him, but this did not change the fate at all. In these various concerts, there was a very young boy at the time who followed Bonham every time, mouth agape, watching him. That boy was named Phil Collins, and he couldn't comprehend the fact that Bonham played with his hands. In fact, Phil Collins tried several times to do this, as he has recounted in various interviews, but he couldn't manage it. He didn't have such tough hands and was enchanted every time. Meanwhile, a certain Jimmy Page, a certain John Paul Jones and their manager Peter Plant were forming a band from the ashes of a group called the Yardbirds. I will talk about the Yardbirds in much more detail in a later episode. What I've told you now are just small pieces of information to lead you to what will eventually be Bonham's story. They convinced Robert Plant to join them, but Plant set the condition that he would bring Bonham with him, who, however, did not want to join the group. And so it took quite a bit of time to convince him. In the end, however, he left the group he was working with right in the middle of a recording session, and for that work he had already received £3,000, but he didn't care. He ultimately decided to follow his destiny. John Paul Jones recounts that the chemistry was immediate. It's not always like that in bands, but in this case, it truly was. They met in a dilapidated basement on Lyle Street, and it was strewn with musical equipment, amplifiers, and so on. And most of those things were stolen. The chemistry in the band, as I already mentioned, was there from the start, but this didn't change the fact that, according to John Paul Jones and according to the others as well, sometimes Bonzo, that is John Bonham, was quite a character. Sometimes In short, they said he was arrogant, especially since he wasn't someone who particularly loved to show off and overshadow others. However, he knew well. He was very aware of what he could do. And sometimes, in short, he expressed it in a way that appeared indeed overbearing to others. He played in this manner. You will be able to tell me how he played, but he had the ability to energize the rest of the band members. That's why this chemistry was created. He provided an energy that no one else could give. Coincidentally, from that moment on, Led Zeppelin's concerts started to sell out. Well, anyway, something we've seen in almost all other situations. The Bonham family, which until that moment had been modest, although they were not poor, but they had to count every penny to make it to the end of the month. Or at least to make ends meet, they found themselves managing a rather large fortune. But before moving on, before talking about how much Bonzo hated the side effects of fame, let's take a look. Precisely because he was called that. The nickname Bonzo was given to him precisely for that quiet part of his personality. In fact, Bonzo was a placid little dog, the protagonist of an old cartoon. This cartoon was created in 1922 by the British cartoonist George Studdy and featured a white, chubby puppy with blue eyes and a short, stubby tail. In short, he was a true idol for the children of that era. And just like Bonzo, our Bonham too. He loved pork sausages and preferred the Walsh brand, which he never failed to bring on tour and entrusted to his roadie. It makes me smile, this thing. It touches me deeply. And it's very strange to compare this hidden, chubby, calm, playful side to his enormous excesses in the later years. But on the other hand, this drummer has always been an ambivalent figure. Even before Zeppelin, he was involved in some strange incidents and was banned by some venues because he played too loudly, but that wasn't the real issue. John Bonham drank. Impressively, it wasn't always like this. He had greatly increased this factor, unfortunately right, when Led Zeppelin hit it big. At first, the success was fun, but as I said before, he was terrified of flying, truly terrified. And every time before boarding, he, needed to ease this fear. Moreover, another thing he couldn't tolerate well was not so much the concerts themselves, of which he still felt the pressure, but it wasn't that, it was the traveling. From one place to another for the concerts, meaning he couldn't stand those endless hours between one concert and another, especially spent in empty and anonymous hotel rooms. And so he had to fill those empty moments, so frightening for him, if we can say so, with alcohol. Alcohol led him to be violent and chaotic. It also led him to play some memorable pranks. The only one who surpassed him in terms of terrible pranks was Keith Moon, the drummer of The Who. And I will dedicate one of the upcoming episodes to Keith Moon. I don't know if it will be the next one, but I will talk about him very soon. We mentioned that John Bonham, when he was drunk, was capable of extremely heavy and violent pranks. In fact, anyone who happened to be around him at those times would invariably find themselves with torn clothes soaked in beer. However, it must be said that when he returned home, everything went back to normal, or almost. In fact, in my biography dedicated to Ozzy, I talk about Bonham, reflecting on him during that period. And Ozzy at the time was married to his first wife, and he drove a tractor to get around because he couldn't drive a car. And Bonham often joined him at home, and sometimes Robert Plant was with him as well. And imagine, they played cards for hours. And it's true that even during those times they drank a lot. But Bonham managed to stay clear-headed enough to cheat at cards and consistently trick Ozzy. Moreover, he loved his children, Jason and Zoe, very much. And when he was clear-headed, when he was at home, away from all the chaos, he devoted himself to them a lot. And he loved very much, he also loved his farm in Worcestershire and the animal breeding. In short, Bonham was ambivalent. From this point of view, because he loved his quiet life with his family, on his estate, on his land, far from the glitz of California and concerts in general, but he also loved danger. In fact, he was passionate about fast driving and would take his car up to 240 miles per hour. All this bravado was probably done, not only to try to overcome his numerous panic attacks. These panic attacks, he often had them, but especially before getting on a plane and before going on stage. To further emphasize his ambivalence, let's talk for a moment about his signature. More than a signature, Mars, it could be defined as a graphic element, and to choose this graphic element, E, which we all now know as. His Bonham brand relied in '71 on a book by Rudolf Koch, The Three Circles. The symbol he chose says a lot about his personality. In fact, it is a motif linked to the idea of the Trinity, but also to family. It can indeed be used to allude to the union between man, woman, and child. So here again, we return to the concept of family. We return to emphasize the roles within the family. Page, mother, and the child. The four graphic elements chosen by the members of the group are what most capture the public's attention. And that is what makes Led Zeppelin 4 enter history. Jimmy Page will say about it, "We had some conflicts with the critics and we wanted to release a completely anonymous album. At first I thought of just one symbol, since there are four of us and it was our fourth album. I designed mine, but the others thought of theirs." The band then began to use these symbols everywhere. This was also a challenge for journalists. The symbols were published in daily ads, and sometimes the band used them for the three previous albums as well. Just think about it. Since then, Led Zeppelin fans have gone crazy trying to assign hidden meanings to these symbols. But since this is not an episode about Led Zeppelin to which I will dedicate plenty of space, I promise you that, let's return to Bonham. In his case as well, the public tried to assign various meanings. Many simply saw the three circles as a drum set from above. Others, however, saw the logo of the American beer Ballantine, perhaps an allusion to that never-conquered alcohol dependency? We cannot know. In '75, Bonham was literally devastated by alcohol, and especially by those endless hours, as I mentioned before, between concerts that led him to drink unimaginable amounts of alcohol. During that period, there were also problems with the English tax authorities, and for this reason, Bonham was forced to live abroad for a certain period. And this, in short, it debilitated him even more. And that noisy, joyful boy, always ready for laughter and jokes, became a rough, violent, and sometimes even mean man. Even though he was always and constantly surrounded by security personnel, he often went beyond the limit. The climax occurred at the Oakland Coliseum in California in 1977, when he was involved in a ferocious assault against an American security guard. John Bonham was arrested for this, and along with him, Peter Plant, manager Richard Collins, and another crew member named John Biden were also arrested. The complaint was so significant that Led Zeppelin were truly banned from America at that time, and everything started to feel rancid from that moment on. Like an otherworldly curse, Carrick, Robert Plant's beloved son, also died, and it was July 26, 1977. The child died from an unspecified infection, and it was a truly tragic, infinitely tragic moment, which I will discuss in much more detail when I tell the story of Robert Plant. Robert Plant was devastated and felt immense guilt towards the child, towards his family, reaching the peak of his distress, as we can all imagine. And it was John Bonham who stayed closest to him. He found the strength to stand by his friend, but this did not prevent him from being unpredictable nonetheless. In fact, the first physical signs of this enormous problem, they were seen in Nuremberg during a concert where he was forced to stop because he simply couldn't play anymore. In September 1980, Led Zeppelin were about to start a new North American tour. The rehearsals were to be held at Jimmy Page's house, and Robert Plant and John Bonham went to the location together. It was at that moment that suddenly John Bonham turned to Robert Plant and told him that he was tired of playing the drums. That day, as the rehearsals began, John Bonham started drinking and didn't stop until midnight. So he drank from noon to midnight, 12 consecutive hours. Of all the things he consumed, we are sure, precisely because others testified he drank at least 40 shots of vodka. He was put to sleep almost completely unconscious by one of his assistants. Unfortunately, the next morning, all the members and the assistants tried to wake him and kept trying until they realized he was dead. The band members were not only devastated, but also very angry with John for reaching that point and also with themselves. Perhaps for not being able to understand in time, I don't know. Peter Plant fell into a depression from which he perhaps never recovered. This depression lasted for years and years, and for a long time people thought that John Bonham had been killed by substances. In fact, it might seem more logical, apparently, but no, it was actually alcohol that killed him. This is also stated by John Paul Jones, and he also states that yes, Bonham had personal problems at that time, but what really killed him was actually the position. In fact, he was lying in the wrong way, and he inhaled his own vomit without being able to wake up and thus died from drowning. Michael, John's brother, was called to Jimmy Page's house, but initially no one told him what had happened. Waiting for him at the top of the driveway was Robert Plant himself, who wanted to speak to him alone, and told him in the gentlest way possible what had happened. It was him who told him that his big brother was no longer there. The funeral took place on October 10th, 1980 in Rushock, Worcestershire. The expressions of grief from Bonham's relatives and family were so heartbreaking that they deeply affected many of those present who still remember them. Who knows what he would have done if he had lived, if he had managed to get through that moment? And unfortunately, we ask ourselves this question all too often because there are far too many artists who have left us due to these problems who were still very young. The Led Zeppelin could have continued with another drummer, as The Who did, for example, when Keith Moon died, but they didn't want to. Realistically, who could really replace him? And anyway, it was something that for the band members was unthinkable, and so they disbanded. However, since then, during Led Zeppelin reunions, other drummers have taken the stage. One of them was Phil Collins and the other was Jason Bonham, John's son. I will dedicate an episode to this last great, truly great drummer who has had a lot of experiences and whose story is at times also moving. I want to end this episode with a quote from John Bonham himself. Once in a delusion of grandeur, he turned lucidly, however, towards Robert Plant, telling him that he believed he was the greatest drummer in the world. And we know today that he was, if not the greatest, one of the greatest rock drummers, that's for sure. I decided to focus mainly on the human aspect of John Bonham's story for various reasons, one of which is that I am not knowledgeable enough to talk about drumming and the techniques related to it. And for this reason, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I will provide you with another video in English below, which specifically talks about John Bonham. Thank you for making it this far again this week and for supporting me and the channel with your affection and passion. A big kiss. Bye.